Well, thanks everybody. It's great to be here once again. This is my third time speaking to the union, and I've spoken on some pretty different subjects. And so I was asked to present on this issue of being disconnected. And as I thought about how I wanted to approach this, because there are a lot of different angles, I found that I was really more going in a philosophical direction, which is really much more in my particular wheelhouse. So this will be a little bit more of a philosophical discussion this evening, and I was told 20 to 40 minutes. It's probably going to be a little closer to the 40-minute mark, but I'll try to keep it as concise as I can. All right, so the proposition that I have been given this evening to defend is as follows. Resolved, we have never been more disconnected. Such a statement may seem incommensurate with the way in which we tend to describe contemporary society, particularly with regard to our many technological advances within the last couple of decades. We use this word connected as a shorthand for all sorts of things, such as the general fact of our being constantly connected to the internet in various ways, or the fact that through that technology we have this connection between us and vast amounts of information, which was never before possible for human beings. Further, and more relevant to the particular subject at hand, we use connected to refer to the relationship that we have with other people by means of the internet. And in some sense, we can say that we are now more connected to other people than ever before. For example, through social media, I might have an awareness of what some man that I took one college class with years ago is doing with his life, even though we may have had one conversation in our lives. Just because we happen to have friended each other on Facebook back when I was in college, because back then Facebook was a platform for college students. Without this technology, I likely would have never sought out this particular person because we didn't know each other very well, nor would I necessarily have even remembered this particular individual's existence, save some chance encounter randomly somewhere engaging my memory. In some way, then, it is true that we are actually more connected to people than we would have been in prior centuries. Such a connection here lies in that we often know more facts about other people that we have only kind of passing acquaintance with, or perhaps more accurately, what we really deem to be fact about those people, recognizing that social media appearances are often really a veneer of reality for the sake of public display and recognition. Furthermore, along with knowing more about people by means of the internet, we also know more people because of the internet than would have been possible otherwise. Speaking of personal experience, through social media, I have interacted throughout the years with thousands of individuals from all across the world who I would not have otherwise encountered. Not that those encounters are always pleasant ones. And while the majority of these relationships never develop into an actual in-person encounter, some of those relationships that I have developed have, and now constitute some of my closest friendships. But for the moment, let us set aside those rare instances of in-person meetings that do lead to deeper relationships, which can at times be initiated through the internet, and discuss those relationships which exist purely in the sphere of social media. As just discussed, there is an increase in interactions between individuals through such mediums, which often leads to an increase in knowledge about various individuals through them. However one wants to characterize such online interactions, knowledge about an individual does not truly constitute connectivity, nor does a distant abstract number of likes from other social media accounts. This building up of information through the internet never truly fulfills the inherent desire that human beings have of being known and acknowledged and addressed, the constituent parts of actual human connection. It is for this reason that the number of likes a post gets on Instagram is never quite enough to satisfy. By its very nature, algorithmically determined digital affirmation cannot fulfill that innate human desire to be acknowledged, because it is never a real personal encounter. It is a counterfeit of human relationality. which approximates the real thing just enough to convince us that if those numbers grew enough, it would satisfy the desire that we have for real personal interaction. And yet even a social media post or a video with an exorbitantly high number of likes, reposts, or views does not satisfy the need for recognition in the way that an evening of delightful conversation with a close friend does. All right, in order to put some statistical backing into the claims that I am making and going to be explaining more here, I will briefly set forth some of the evidence that mental health is in severe decline and that to a significant extent social media is seemingly the cause of this. In his book, The Anxious Generation, Jonathan Haidt shows that mental health among both men and women fell rapidly between the years of 2010 and 2020. The percentage of students of this age, high school and college students with anxiety disorders, increased in that time by 134%, and depression increased by 106%. This is not just self-reported mental health issues, as is seen in the growth in suicides. Suicide rates have grown by 91% among boys and 167% among girls in that period. This same period saw the mass growth of social media and smartphone availability as people continue to spend more time on their devices. In particular, the beginning of and the following popularization of Instagram from 2010 to 2012 seems to have contributed to a rapid rise of mental health concerns, which were most pronounced in preteen and young teenage girls. With Instagram, there was increased pressure to look a certain way when posting on the app, which created a form of social connection that relied on photographic appearance rather than actual in-person interaction. Further, this emphasis on documentation of life events meant, and still means, that often people don't just enjoy their time with one another if they're on vacations or concerts or whatever they're doing. Instead, they're spending their time thinking about, how can I document this particular event? As Haidt argues, this issue is not only with preteens and teenagers, however, but it also goes back to young childhood. The technological overtaking of childhood has led to the prominence of tablets and smartphones in the hands of very young children, which Haidt refers to as experience blockers. There are essential elements of childhood development that are being missed here, particularly self-play, self-expression, and creative play among children. It is through this kind of play that young boys and girls begin to become sociable, attain skills of self-governance, relatability, empathy, and emotional regulation. A childhood that is based around screens, and especially around the kind of orientation toward social media that we have been talking about here, allows these children to miss those crucial rituals of socialization and then gets them to think about questions of, well, how am I being perceived while I am doing activity X, Y, or Z? Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean that little children are spending their time with Instagrams, but what they are doing is they're watching their parents living that way, and they are spending time watching YouTubers who are constantly asking for likes and subscriptions. And so it gets them into that same kind of mindset so that they are prepared for a life of addiction to social media moving into adulthood. All right. Well, now I want to move from there into the real argument that I want to make about what human connectivity is and why these things are divorcing us from that connectivity. So it's necessary first to define exactly what connectivity is in the sense that is being discussed here. It is my contention that connectivity consists in a series of I-thou encounters in which a complex web of relationships is created and sustained, such that needs of recognition, value, and teleological direction are met within one's communal bonds and obligations. And hopefully I'll explain that enough that you understand what I'm getting at here. When a connection is made between two people, even in the most basic of interpersonal interactions, There are three fundamental presuppositions that are necessary preconditions for such events. The first of these is rather simple, that there is a unified self, that there is an I who is communicating. To address another is to acknowledge oneself as one who is capable of the act of addressing, and as a singular identifiable subject to whom the other person is meant to respond. The second recognition that is fundamental to any communication is that there is a differentiation between the I and the you. Any conversation necessitates a separation between subject and subject, or between a self and an other. To address someone is to acknowledge them as other. With this recognition of another, there is also a recognition of one's own personal identity. The sense of self that we have arises not simply from internal isolated identification, it is also a product of our consistent actions of differentiation. I understand myself both as one who addresses others and as one who is capable of being addressed by others. This relationality of two individuals arises out of the mutual recognition of differentiation between self and other, which both gives us an understanding of us as individuals who are not identical with the other, but also as individuals who are able to address the other, and consequently have an understanding of the other as one who is not us but is capable of addressing us. This leads then to the third presupposition of relationality, which is that despite the difference that exists between the self and the other, there is also some kind of underlying union between those two persons. There is a sense of sameness that is assumed between the individual and his or her interlocutor, such that it is believed that communication is actually possible between two people. Were this not the case, no communication would ever be attempted. In an act of communication, whether it's verbal communication or some other form, two selves are sharing something about their own experience, their lives, their inner lives with one another in a common space, the space that they share, that they meet together. Regardless how trivial that interaction may be, it is a commonality in coming together and sharing of one another. There is, in human interaction, more happening here than just learning information about the other person. When two people meet face to face, there is an inherent mutual recognition of personhood of the other person. The nature of these face-to-face encounters that I'm talking about here is explored in Jewish philosopher and theologian Martin Buber's 1923 essay, I and Thou. In this work, Buber exposits the distinct types of relationality that people have with regard to one another and to the world. Buber contends that there are three general signifiers that can be used to explain the role which persons and objects play in relation to one another. There is the I, there is the you or the thou, as Buber's going to say, and it. In contrast to the later Derridian dismissals of all metaphysics of presence, Buber contends that presence is essential to us as human beings, particularly essential to relationality within the I-thou connection that he expands. It is within the presence of two subjects that an encounter, which Buber refers to as an act of revelation between two people, arises between subjects. When these two subjects have such an encounter, they meet together in that common space that exists between them, the realm of mutuality, in which these two shared presences recognize one another. These interactions of intersubjective recognition, what he calls the I-thou encounters, are to be distinguished for Buber from I-it relations. In an I-it relationship, the person or the thing which one encounters is viewed as an object of examination, analysis, or manipulation rather than as a personal subject. In his essay, Buber uses the example of a tree to distinguish between these two different kinds of encounters. If a human person encounters a tree, he or she might begin to think about the tree with questions of its aesthetic value in mind. Somebody could analyze and think about the tree, the colors that compose that particular tree, maybe how it might be painted, maybe the texture of the bark of that tree. Or one could analyze the tree with questions of scientific classification in view, considering the type of tree that this particular object is, or try to determine the relative age of the tree in relation to the life cycle of that tree. These are all examples of I-it relations. That same tree, however, if encountered within one's own personal experience, as one simply walks through the forest, who looks up at that tree with no detailed mental analysis of what it is, but simply looks at it and thinks that's a beautiful tree and encounters it for what it is. That is an I-thou encounter. Though, of course, still distinct from the kind of I-thou encounter someone has with a conscious mind. But in his discussion of these issues, Buber distinguishes between three kinds of relations: those between human beings with one another, those with human beings and other living things or with nature, and those between human beings and what he refers to as intelligible forms. All of this for Buber is rooted in God, who is the ultimate personality, through whom all of these I-thou encounters arise. All revelation of presences in these personal encounters is a revelation of the divine nature. For our present purposes, what is most essential in Buber's system is his identification of these varied dynamics of interpersonal encounters. Theories of panpsychism notwithstanding, which is the notion that consciousness just kind of exists in all things, there is a revelation that occurs here. And in the kind of encounter that we have with nature, which contrasts with those conscious subjects, where nature is making itself known to man, but man is not in the same way making himself known to nature. And this contrasts with that personal encounter. And so in a person-to-person I-thou encounter, there is a distinct revelation of one consciousness to another distinct consciousness as they meet one another. Interpersonal relationships, however, relationships between people, can also become I-it encounters. Learning facts about another person, even while perhaps the individual is present in a literal sense, though maybe not present in the sense of being acknowledged or recognized or directly addressed, is such an occurrence. When this kind of relation overtakes actual acknowledgement of presence, other people are seen as mere tools to be manipulated, attacked, or mobilized for the sake of one's own agenda. In Kantian terminology, people become mere means rather than ends in themselves. It must be clarified here, however, that I-it encounters are not always negative things. There is value about thinking about people, getting information, or considering what might be true of somebody that you have encountered. That's an essential part of relationality. For Buber, relationships, and that is true between people with one another and people in nature, kind of move back and forth between these two kinds of relationality, the I-thou and the I-it interactions. But true, real human connectivity is not found in that I-it way of encountering a subject, but in that direct interpersonal encounter of the I-thou relations. Now, I contend that a significant feature of our modern world is the predominance of I-it relations over and against those more essential instances of revelation of oneself to others through I-thou encounters. The ubiquitous presence of social media in its various forms has really made this an inevitability. When an individual says something objectionable on social media, whatever platform it might be, that person is probably going to be immediately attacked by a number of other people without any seeming concern for the kind of understanding or dialogue or search for context which are essential to any face-to-face conversation. Because that realm of mutuality, that shared space where real connection occurs, is missing. Because neither people involved in what at least is called a conversation are actually present to one another. And so because of that, because of the predominance of these I-it forms of relations, people then become mere packets of information to process. And like information, they can quickly be discarded if they are useless, or affirmed if they are useful. And so this is not simply true of the way that people interact with someone on the other side of any given political, cultural, or religious divide. Those who affirm one's own ideology or values are similarly only viewed as tools to be used for one's own ends, which is why those people can be so quickly discarded when they no longer serve those purposes. A related problem to this is the prominence of parasocial relationships. In the 20th century culture of celebrity, which had plenty of its own problems, don't get me wrong, there was at least a pretty clear divide between a famous man or woman and the fans of that person. Unhealthy obsessions or misperceptions of connection between the two were certainly not unknown at the time, but this was not really the norm in the way that it has become today. With the creation of YouTube, entertainment moved away from the hands of a select few large corporations and was now given to individual creators. Hence came the rise of the content creator or the influencer. Well, some of the largest creators do make content that is basically indistinguishable from, earlier media corporations. Think about what people are now calling the Mr. Beastification of YouTube. Many influencers are popular precisely because they don't do that. They do not create the types of polished videos with large budgets that someone like Mr. Beast might. But instead, they speak and act like one would with close friends. A great example of this is Emma Chamberlain, who began to create vlogging videos of her just kind of living her life and kind of rambling on and on about whatever she felt like back in 2016. And within 2 years, she had blown up. She was a huge celebrity, one of the top creators on the platform. Viewers of creators and content like this watch these videos with the feeling that they're having some kind of intimate relationship with the person that is being viewed, as if the two are really sitting down and having a conversation, or just kind of living life together as you would with a friend. And yet one of the people involved in these interactions is not even aware of the existence of the other person. And so there is something that approximates human connection here, but without this presence of two subjects who actually acknowledge one another, it remains empty. Now, there's a lot more going on here in the story of this lack of connectivity than just the rise of the internet. That's kind of exacerbated these already present issues. The problems that we see here with this lack of community are already present within modernity and post-modernity. And so before anyone had ever conceived of anything like what the internet is, or even computers at all, there was an epidemic of loneliness and isolation that had already overtaken many Western nations. It's for this reason that existentialism rose to prominence in the early 20th century. A read of popular modernist literature reveals these feelings, such as Franz Kafka's dreamlike portrayal of life in his The Castle in 1926, or his other stories and works, as a series of kind of bizarre, random, and faceless encounters with abstract, bureaucratic entities, while the individual is just isolated and confused in the midst of this. Or the struggle that is faced by Hans Castorp, the protagonist of Thomas Mann's The Magic Mountain in 1927, who was afraid to leave a Swiss sanitarium that he initially enters into to visit his cousin because the outside world is so full of loneliness and hardship. Similar themes can be seen in the arts through movements like abstract expressionism or surrealism, or in film with the movies of someone like Ingmar Bergman. In his 1953 book, The Quest for Community, sociologist Robert Nisbet of Columbia University explains this phenomenon as the result of an increasing decline in and loss of mediating institutions in the Western world since the Middle Ages. As he describes it, the average person in the medieval world was continually engaged with a variety of local institutions that guided daily life. This included the church, the family, and by the family he means something far bigger than just what we think of as the immediate or nuclear family, guilds that somebody might belong to, and various other obligations that someone has within the village. Each of these institutions was, by the very nature of the makeup of medieval society, advantageous or necessary for a flourishing life, socially, spiritually, financially. Through a series of historical events and intellectual developments in the latter part of the Middle Ages, these basic units of society began a process of slow disintegration. With the Enlightenment, especially through French thinkers like Rousseau and the later Jacobins like Robespierre and others, these social organizations were viewed as often instruments of oppression that hindered men and women from achieving the kind of self-realization that really can only be discovered from within. There was, therefore, a purposeful attempt to demolish many of these mediating institutions, as the individual, by him or herself, became viewed as the primary unit of society. Well, in order to proceed with the argument here, it's necessary to define exactly what Nisbet means by mediating institutions. The term mediating here refers to the fact that these institutions stand between the individual and the state. In early medieval European society, the average individual did not have really much of a direct relationship to the state. There's a sense in which the kings in medieval Europe had greater power than governments in democratic societies today, and that the king technically owned all of the land in his kingdom. And he was able to freely grant that land to whoever he wished. In another sense, however, the state was pretty unobtrusive in many ways in the lives of its citizens. Simply because the king, by nature of the size of a kingdom, which still weren't that big in the medieval period, he simply didn't have the large kind of bureaucratic apparatus that would be necessary to control the lives of what everybody was doing day to day. What that meant is that the control of land was generally granted to different nobles. This leads to what we think of today as the aristocracy. And the average person, the average peasant in medieval society didn't really have this kind of direct relationship with the state. Generally, the average citizen would have lived on the land of a specific noble or nobles, and any interaction they had with anyone in power would be there. But most of the public life that was lived within these mediating institutions, whether it was the village, the guild, the church, or the family. Now, this all had changed really by the late Middle Ages. And so by that time, by the time you get to about the 16th century, the ambitions of medieval monarchs had grown significantly, such that they began to send large expeditions to unknown continents. Armies grew much larger. They demanded higher taxes. And they developed more distinct territorial boundaries, which is part of what led to the creation of the modern nation-state. Religious wars in Europe further divided nations from one another and strengthened the state's role in the determination of the religious life in the Commonwealth. Shifts within political philosophy moved away from the conception of political authority as beholden to divine appointment and as subject to the laws of God, toward one in which the primary role of the state became the protection of the autonomy of the individual. As Patrick Deneen, professor of political science at University of Notre Dame, has articulated, the preservation and protection of an increased list of individual rights has, in the modern state, corresponded also to growing bureaucratic structures that are needed to protect those rights. There is, therefore, a relationship between the growing isolation of the individual and the growing power of the state. Both of these factors continue to divorce people from the place where life really is actually lived in locally present community. In describing this breakdown of these traditional forms of community, Nisbet notes that this loneliness leads modern man and woman into the position of seeking that natural human hunger for interpersonal belonging elsewhere than in the local. He writes this, he says, where there is widespread conviction that community has been lost, there will be a conscious quest for community in the form of association that seems to promise the greatest moral refuge. In the present age, for enlarging masses of people, this same quest terminates in the political party or action group. It is for this reason that both the political right and the political left have sought to identify themselves with abstract entities and ideologies more than with inherited local institutions. Nisbet's proposal here is of a conservative communitarianism, where rather than an increasing reliance on the power of the state for conservative ideological ends, conservatives would instead devote themselves to the creation, sustaining, and defending of these mediating institutions. In our current milieu, this has, on the right, been replaced by loyalty to the abstraction that we refer to as a nation, as is evidenced in the rise of national conservatism and in its twin error of anti-institutional populism. The left similarly continues to emphasize the growth of government programs on a national level, governed by an endless list of federal agencies with increased regulatory power. Further, the contemporary left has aligned itself with the most powerful megacorporations in the United States as tools for political messaging and suppression of dissenting views. The point is that neither of these political allegiances truly responds to the problem of this epidemic of loneliness and disconnection, as both seek for an answer in large national or international abstractions rather than in the local places where life is actually lived. A significant element to all of this, which was not a factor in Nesbitt's own time, is the way in which we now tend to use the word community to refer to things that are not really communities at all. The internet has become a much used antidote to this already existent problem in society of this loneliness epidemic. But it's not an actual remedy for the sickness that we seek to cure, any more than a handful of Advil is a cure for a broken bone. When people are unable to find life in community in an actual local context, they then seek out its counterfeit in online forums. Rather than finding actual relationships with real people, we join a subreddit, discover a group of accounts on Twitter or X to follow, find Twitch streamers to watch, and connect to various other groups of people online. And in doing so, we isolate ourselves from reality by aligning with what we call communities that are really nothing more than collections of people who happen to share exactly the same biases, beliefs, and values and interests that we ourselves already have. What arises out of this is not community at all, but instead an echo chamber that we participate in simply to confirm us in our own present condition. This creation of these online communities has a twofold result. First, it divorces us from many of the benefits of actual community, which forces us to interact with people who are not like us, do not share our beliefs, and do not like all of the things that we do. Real community forces us to live outside of ourselves for the sake of the other, or at the very least forces us to put up with the other, who is unlike us. Online faux communities do precisely the opposite. They cause us to use others for the sake of our own interests, such that people become simply tools of personal affirmation. That is why people in such online communities are so easily discarded when they express a divergent opinion. The second result of this is that personal and communal identity, often in these communities, are formed more by what people are against rather than what they are actually for. Now, creating an enemy is a very easy way to create a bond between people. But it's not one that creates a true and lasting bond or a lasting connection. Further, it continues to inflame suspicions that the other side, which a communal group has formed its identity in opposition to, is nothing more than a cartoonishly evil bunch of bad actors. Now, I know I'm running low on time here, so I may move ahead on some of this. Now, I will say that there are elements of this contemporary online community that do kind of approximate elements of what we think of as real community or real human connection. Part of that is that it is true that in real human communities, we do have this sense of identity through differentiation. And I mentioned this with Martin Buber in interpersonal interactions, is that we understand our own self-identity not just as it is in itself, but also in response to and connection to others. Communities are the same way. Any community is going to, in some way, define itself as not another community or different from this or that community. But communal self-differentiation does not have to be so oppositional as it really almost always is on the internet. When differentiated communities live and work within the same local places in which individuals associated with each other actually communicate with one another, their differentiation is less likely to devolve into simplistic friend-enemy dynamics. Communities can self-differentiate in very healthy ways, working toward cooperation or friendly competition rather than binary categorizations of good and evil, as in reality, all of us and all communities are a bit of a mix of both. With the increased isolation of ideologically homogeneous spaces, this differentiation has often become dehumanization, such that the personhood of the ideologically other is not recognized at all. All right, conclusion. I began this talk with the following proposition. Resolved, we have never been less connected. In my attempt to defend this claim, I defined connectivity as a series of I-thou encounters, which hopefully you have a decent understanding of at this point, in which a complex web of relationships is created and sustained, being that we have the apparatuses in place, that these are continual encounters. Our life is lived in a way that we're constantly having these back and forths of these I-thou interpersonal encounters. And that within our communities or these spaces, the needs of recognition, value, and teleological direction, or something that orients us toward our goals, are met within our communal bonds and obligations. As discussed throughout this presentation, in our contemporary world, the number of I-thou encounters that an individual has decreased by every measurable standard. The communal spaces in which such encounters are not only possible but also prevalent and necessary are either no longer extant or are far less essential element of life than in prior generations. It is for this reason that people today are consistently looking for recognition and value through other means, such as with social media affirmation. In getting this recognition through social media, it is evident that fulfillment is simply not being found, as decline in mental health is correlated strongly with the prevalence and use of such platforms. Further, people today are often left without the kind of clear direction and purposes which are provided by local institutions, communal bonds, obligations, and teleological direction, as I defined. As people are without given communal institutions in which they live day to day, and leaving the decision to find such communities up to the autonomous power of the individual often leads people to being overwhelmed by the amount of choices that are available, while also feeling unfulfilled by the ones or the choices that are actually committed to. Therefore, in light of all that I have presented here, I contend that it is indeed true that we have never been less connected. Thank you.
I feel like you're not allowed to have a different point of view in that scenario. And so what is the difference between those two?
Yeah, sure. I think that's a really good question. Now, I would say not all communities are healthy communities, right? Just because you have a community doesn't mean it's a healthy one. So, theoretically, you could have a community, the Taliban. You could have a community where everybody agrees on everything, and maybe they feel like those like in-person communal needs are met, but that still doesn't make it actually fruitful or healthy, because I think there's more to the question of what makes a healthy or good community, which is the question of like what are the proper ends? What's the telos of a community as a whole? And then how are we aligning toward that? Which I think is a different question than the question of is there connectivity in that community? So I'd say in terms of the question of connectivity in unhealthy communities, there probably is that, but that doesn't mean that it's oriented toward proper ends. Any community is going to have, and I think a community needs to have, kind of a shared teleology, meaning a shared purpose for it to be a community, and also difference. So you need some kind of balance of shared ideals as well as differentiation to have that proper balance. Because if you have no shared ideals at all, well, you can't really have a society. If nobody agrees on anything, right? If nobody agrees, that murder is a bad thing, well, of course you couldn't function in society like that. or if all of society doesn't agree that cannibalism is probably not the best idea. And that's in the most broad sense, right? That's a shared value. To some extent, you have to have some shared values. But when you get a system where people are so kind of homogenous or closed off that there's no differentiation between people, well, now you've cut off what is one of the most, as I said, the most beneficial things about communities you have to have. It's healthy to have pushback and differentiation. Yeah, so I put a lot of thought into this and over many years, and I feel like my general thoughts, I don't know, maybe I've just become more pessimistic over time, but initially I think when in online communities, there have always been unhealthy elements of online communities, but it's certainly gotten worse. I think there's no doubt that it's gotten worse. I think there are a lot of reasons for that, and I don't think it's just the fact that it's online, but the more that I have thought about it, I think that at least in the way that certain communities are structured, it's inherent to the thing itself. And I think it's just the nature of many social media platforms. So I'll give you Twitter as an example. And I have been on Twitter, very active on Twitter for many years. I've got 21,000 followers on this stupid platform and have wasted way too many hours of life on the thing. And I went from a place where when I started engaging in Twitter, I'm a Lutheran theologian. I was in this little group of Lutheran theologians. There aren't that many of us, right? We're talking about theology and philosophy, and it's this little kind of group of maybe 30 people that are interacting. And over the many years, that has now devolved into nearly anything that I say. I get a barrage of comments telling me that I must be part of a Jewish cabal. I'm not even Jewish, but I don't even know where that comes from, but I hear it all the time for some reason. It's just really, really bizarre. So is that just because of the way that Twitter regulations are? Well, I think there's more to it than that. I think it's the way that the whole thing is structured is that we attune our minds when we're gathering information through scrolling to gathering information. That's what you're doing, right? You're getting stimulation, you're getting information. And so if you're in this mode of scrolling and just kind of mindless entertainment or information or whatever it might be, I think if you're in that mode of scrolling when you're seeing things that people are actually saying, I think your brain is naturally going to dehumanize them because your brain is already naturally in that mode of gathering information or entertainment or whatever else. And so I think when we don't have that any really realm for direct encounters. So I don't want to say that all online anything is bad, but I think that on a lot of platforms it's kind of inherent to the platform itself. I don't think it's just true about Twitter because I look at Reddit and I think it's the same way. I think Twitter tends to be now this way for the right and Reddit tends to be that way for the left. I was just on Reddit. I don't know why, but I encountered just a discussion randomly somewhere where someone on a subreddit that wasn't about politics, has a clear left bias, just like Twitter tends to have a clear right bias today. And someone was talking about some woman claiming to have been raped, and this comment just says immediately, but she voted for Trump, so we shouldn't believe her. And then she got all these upvotes. I'm like, are you insane? What does this have, does your morality change because you now are encountering somebody who has a different political view than you do? And that kind of thing, I just think it's so prevalent that I think it's kind of inherent in the platform. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. I'd love to be wrong. I just don't think I am.
A little bit more similar in ideology, maybe not the exact same, but people that don't differ as far from these groups.
Yeah, I think it's essential to a holistic life to have both of those things. You need to have people that are aligned with you ideologically that are probably going to make up your closest friendships, and that's fine. Because those are the people you're going to be able to, you have shared values, you're going to be able to be honest and open with them without getting into an argument all the time. Sometimes those debates, can be fun when you have ideologically opposed friends, but those spaces I think are very good and necessary for us, and that's how communities form. Communities, tend to form around those shared values. And so I'm a pastor, and I'm a Lutheran pastor, which means that I spend time with people in a congregation that have gathered together because we have the same values, we have the same beliefs. But if I were to spend all of my time with those people in my Lutheran pastor friends and my Lutheran congregation, and I had zero contact with anybody outside of that, even if it was like other Christian groups that weren't Lutheran, if I didn't ever talk to those people, that would cause significant issues, because probably my perception of what they believed and practiced would be completely wrong, because it would be formed just by people who oppose it instead of the actual people themselves. So I think that's what's really great about this space. Something I love about the political union. I feel like this is one of the few spaces that tends to be a very healthy space, and that you are listening to people with opposing views and actually engaging thoughtfully with each other. So yeah, you need to have a balance of both of those things. Yeah. So you could be in a situation where you're like, I want to have this real connection with you. I want us to actually talk. And the other person just refuses to kind of get into the I-thou mode of communication and sticks in that I-it. I mean, at that point, there's only so much you could do. I don't know that you can really force somebody out of that mode into that I-thou mode. So I wish I had better advice, a better answer for you, but unfortunately I don't. Yeah. Yeah. Oh boy. So there's a lot there, because catfish and bots are kind of two different things. So on the one hand, you have people who hide behind anonymous accounts, and I know a lot of you do. That's a fact, I know. I'm completely opposed to using anons altogether. I think that there are this is a Lutheran distinction that we use in our theology. We talk about the law of God as a curb, and a curb on a road, it's meant to keep you in the general right place, and it stops you at least from hopefully driving off the side of the road and crashing into somebody. And so it's like a guardrails, right? They establish boundaries, and one of those boundaries that society needs to have guardrails in some ways, right? You can't have a society without guardrails. And one of those is there is a sense of shame that is good, because sometimes and shame can be bad, right? You can have shame for things that aren't shameful in a society, but there are things that should cause shame, and there are things you should be ashamed of. And I think that when you remove what is that kind of natural protection that we should have in human community, there are things that, you should feel bad about saying in front of people, because they're not kind things to say, and not just not kind, but they're not beneficial. They're not fruitful in any way other than you tearing somebody down. When something is not beneficial, then you probably shouldn't be saying it. And do I think in real person communities today, maybe we have too many guardrails about what can be said and what cannot be said. I think that's a serious issue today. But that doesn't mean you just throw them away altogether. And I feel like that's what a lot of certain platforms have tended to do. So I think that there is I don't think anonymous accounts are generally a good thing, because there are just all sorts of things that we think that we shouldn't say. We teach this to our kids at the youngest ages, right? Don't we say this? If you don't have anything nice to say, don't say anything. And you try to train your kids not to just say whatever the heck comes into their head, because it's not beneficial. And when you remove that barrier and put anonymity there, I think I don't think it's a healthy form of human communication. And the question of bots is going to be a more significant one. And that's one where the question is well, what the heck is communication? What is real human communication? Because if you're interacting with, AI, and if people are talking about this, dead internet theory, where they have this idea that eventually bots are basically going to take over the entire internet and people are going to all be gone at some point or whatever. Are you communicating or are you not? I don't know. I think that it does. It's not a good thing. And no, I wouldn't say it's the same as interacting with the human person, but it does show one of the dangers, that is, it's a lot harder to discern truth from what is not when you're in that context.
Get a true connection, and when you take the certain scenario in which there is a lack of social connectivity.
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. It's a really great point, because during the pandemic, I did the same thing myself. I talk to people on Zoom all the time, because I'm I need people to talk to, and I'm stuck in my house. And man, living in Ithaca when there are no students here is weird. It felt really creepy here. It's just ghost town. And so I would say a couple things about that. One is, I think we can genuinely talk about kind of levels of human connection. So I don't think it has to be an all or nothing. You have no connection to the internet. There is. There's a reason why we talk to people on the phone. There's a reason why, people write each other, not that they do it much anymore, but people have historically written each other letters, right? So there's a form of connection. But I think we recognize that when you have a friend that you're talking to on Zoom, it's never quite the same as when you're in person. So we talk about levels of connection there. So I don't want to discount the goods that come from that. But I think the things you're thinking of here are more actual connections. In that, okay, so when Buber talks about these I-thou relations, sometimes he uses language like, when this interpersonal connection is happening, you're speaking to the other person as if no one else is, or nothing else is there, like your attention is all on them. That's when you have a real connection. And so I think you can get a sense of that when you're using certain platforms, right? So if you're on the phone, if you're on a Zoom call, you're actually also able to engage with their face too, so it's a little different. Or even if you're messaging somebody or you're in a group chat, that's different though, I think, than when you're on a public forum where it's a bunch of people, you don't know each other. You don't know who any of these people are. Maybe you know who some of the people are, but you're all just kind of faceless people just kind of saying things to each other. So I think that is different. So there is some good that's developed in that way through technology too. All right.